Everybody, thank you so much for being here to help me launch my book, The Hopping Ghost. That is what I want to hear. Look, I'm only going to speak briefly, and then I'm going to read like a little piece out of the book to give you a taste of what it's like. But first, I kind of wanted to explain a little bit about it to you, because when you write a book, you have to have a one-line way of explaining it. Because everyone says, oh, what's your book about? And what I've been saying is it's a sassy Scottish vampire in Shanghai a century ago. And I get that face. Oh, that sounds interesting. Because it doesn't make sense. None of it really comes together. I think the book comes together beautifully, but the ideas don't make sense. So I just want to explain where it comes from, so at least you understand before you maybe buy a book. So the questions are, for me, why a vampire, why a Shanghai, why a century ago? And so the vampire appears in my first book, Discipline. This is about a young bloke becoming an apprentice to a black magician and learning black magic, doing deals with demons. And he has his final exams, and one of his examiners, a character I invented very quickly off the cuff, was the Queen of the Vampires. And she was a great character. She was kind of charming and really intelligent and very dangerous, and I liked her a lot. And I thought, I want to get her backstory. How did she become the Queen of the Vampires? So I thought I should write that book, but it's taken me 10 years to get around to it, because I wanted to come up with an original idea about what a vampire is, because there are thousands of vampire books. I have read most of them, and most of them are terrible because they're unoriginal. There is nothing new in them. So it took me all that time to figure out, what is a vampire? Why do they do what they do? And I think I've come up with an original idea. So in this book, a vampire is a person who's been infested by a kind of cosmic parasite, a thing made of magnetic fields which lives in your brain. And during the daytime, the sunlight is too much. It has to fold itself away. But during the night, it unfolds. And it needs the blood, because the extra iron in your system means that the magnetic fields can move your limbs and make you stronger and make you faster and enable you to do all the things, the whirly eyes, etc., that vampires do, all come from the magnetic thing that lives inside you. It also means that during the day you are human. You're not weak, you're just human. And so that's what the vampire was. And that's how I wanted to get this book kicked off with that vampire. Next, why Shanghai and why a century ago? Well, let me introduce you to this gentleman who has a bit of the dedication in my book. William Ewart Fairbairn. He lived in Shanghai at this time, and he's the reason why that's where the book is. You've probably never heard of him, but I found him on a knife in my second book. Thank you. Cheek Magnet, which is about a ninja accountant. I wanted to put a really cool knife into the hands of the main character, and went looking through the history of knives to find a cool knife. And what I found was the Fairbairn Sykes combat knife, which was the knife that the commandos used in the Second World War. And most army knives are multi-purpose tools. You can dig a trench with them, you can open a can of Spam with them. The Fairbairn Sykes knife is purely a killing machine, and it looks like it, and it's a very cool looking long leaf-shaped blade. And I got looking up, who's Fairbairn? Who's the guy? Who's Sykes? Who are they? It turns out they were these two Englishmen who had served in the police force in Shanghai for 20, 30 years, and were the best people in the world for training soldiers. When the Second World War came, the English said, who do we get to train our guys? And they found Fairbairn and Sykes, who'd been training police officers in the toughest beat in the world for 20 years, how to fight, how to shoot, how to stab, how to survive. And the more I read about William Fairbairn, the more I loved him and admired him and wanted him to be a part of my next book, because he's just such a fascinating guy. To have an idea of why he is what he is, you have to understand Shanghai itself. So in the 1800s, China controlled itself very carefully. You want to trade with China, you go to this one guy at this one warehouse at one city. He'll tell you what we'll take and what we won't, and he'll tell you the price. So there was this massive market, and all the European powers could not get people in there. And they fought 2 wars over it, called the Opium Wars, because what they wanted to get into China was opium. All the European powers owned chunks of the Middle East and chunks of the subcontinent where opium grew really easily and well. And you could bring it over for next to nothing. And so they fought for the right to sell opium into China. And part of the answer to that was that China gave them pieces of Shanghai. So there was a Russian concession, there was a French concession, and there was a third concession kind of co-owned by the English and Americans called the International Settlement. They made money hand over fist. So they're bringing in literally shiploads of opium and selling it in the tiny amounts that opium gets sold in and making gold by the bucketful and taking out everything China had to offer. So paper and spices and pottery and tea and timber, everything China had, they took out en masse and made scads of money. But think about the social setup. City of maybe 1 million Chinese people, mostly very poor. And inside it you have these enclaves of incredibly wealthy Europeans. So you have this massive inequality. You have this, imagine being a Chinese person and these Europeans have come in here and taken a piece of your city. Imagine how you feel about them. And then add to that a pipeline of the most intense drug known to man. And it's the perfect ingredients for crime. Poverty, inequality, drugs, it just was crime-ridden. It was the toughest city in the world. Slavery, kidnapping for ransom. Has everyone heard of the phrase to be Shanghaied? The trade in Shanghai was so intense that they couldn't get enough sailors to do that shipping back and forth. And literally, if you got drunk in a bar on the waterside, you would wake up in a ship partway to Shanghai or partway from Shanghai. So that would happen. Murder in the streets, gang warfare in the streets. Shanghai was tough. And in comes William Fairbairn as like a guy in his early 20s. And he's a Royal Marine. He's a tough man. He knows, one end from a bayonet from the other. And he comes to Shanghai and signs up with the police force as an ex-soldier. And in his first year, he is beaten to a pulp by the Green Gang who ran most of the city and left for dead. And literally had to be dragged out of the gutter and dragged into hospital. And when he woke up, he said, "Never again. I will never let that happen to me again." And he went to learn how to fight. And he found a Japanese jiu-jitsu teacher. Ended up being one of the first white men in the world to get a black belt in jiu-jitsu from a Japanese university. And he found a local temple boxing guy and he learned temple boxing. And some of his recruits knew wrestling and boxing and he learned from them. And he put it together into a coherent little martial art that he called Defendu. And he sold books about it. The English bought books on Defendu. And it became a course that he could teach a young man who knew basically nothing about combat. And in 3 months, he could turn you into someone who could fight and survive in Shanghai. In the next 20 years, it's estimated he had 2,000 fights and he did not lose one. He also taught them how to knife fight because sometimes when you're that close in a room, a knife is the thing to pick up. He also developed an entirely new way of shooting. Before Fairbairn, they all learned to shoot like it was target practice. Isosceles stance, hand like this, view like that. Fairbairn realised that most gun combat happens inside a room. You don't need to aim, you point it like pointing a finger. And so his guys learn to fire like that. Fire twice. You've ever heard the phrase double tap? All the video gamers here will have heard the phrase double tap, to shoot twice so they definitely die. That's from William Fairbairn. He invented the modern SWAT team. He's an incredible guy. So that's why I wanted to have him in the book. Because as a martial artist myself, I admire him so much. And his city, what better place to set a vampire book? You've got Chinese people and English people and French people and Russian people. You've got war in the streets. You've got drugs going on. You've got this clash of cultures. What an amazing place to set a book. So, at the start of the book, I'll tell you a little bit about what happens at the very start of the book. Hepzibah, the vampire. She's Scottish. She's a little tiny redhead. She was made a vampire in Scotland and a couple of years later was taken captive by someone who knew what she was and how to handle her, shipped overseas and sold into slavery. And she spent 30 years in the basement of a gang used to terrify and execute their enemies. If you'd done something bad, they would feed you to the red monster who lives in the basement, this thing who lives in the basement. And the vampire inside her head at the start of the book has put her human mind to sleep because the human mind was going mad. And so she's been asleep. The human part of her has been asleep for 30 years. And Fairbairn, coming in to destroy the red monster, realises she's a person and lets her go. And so she comes into Shanghai, figuring out who she is and trying to become a human again. She doesn't want to be a monster anymore. That's kind of the setup of the book, that Hepzibah does not want to be a monster anymore and she wants to be a person again. And she's learning how to do that. Hepzibah, at this point in the book, has managed to find a place to live. She's at a rooming house with a couple of other girls, and she's looking for work, and she's got some new clothing. She hasn't had clothing in years. It takes her like most of a day just to get herself clean after 30 years of living in a basement. And she's kind of finally had her first human day. And this is the end of the day. Hepzibah was tired and content. She'd had a wonderfully human day and was very much ready for bed. But the vampire was freshly awakened from its daytime slumber and couldn't wait to explore its new city and the herd of humans who lived in it. It tweaked Hepzibah's brain and sent a fresh rush of endorphins around to pep her up. So when the house had quietened and it suggested a stroll, she was more than ready for it. Straight out the window for a rooftop run in the moonlight, going northeast towards the busiest parts of the city. A familiar smell came to her, the healthy tang of William Fairbairn. She traced it to an alleyway behind a warehouse where he was sneaking along with 3 Chinese officers. With silent signals, he positioned them around a doorway. The biggest one kicked the door in, and Fairbairn dashed inside, followed by his men. Hepzibah dropped to the ground and went in after them, curious about what they were doing. The warehouse was 3 stories tall. Inside it was one giant room full of sturdy industrial shelving, crammed with crates and boxes, stinking of metal and oil. She climbed quickly to the top of the nearest stack of shelves and followed the policeman into the depths of the building. They ran in a funny crouch, fast and quiet, one hand on their holsters. Ahead she could hear several other men in the warehouse, as yet unaware they were being raided. Half a dozen of these other men were gathered together, talking loudly about horse racing and eating what smelled like rife and beef tendons. One of them had heard the bang of the door opening and was coming to investigate. She watched Fairbairn silently signal his men, sending one to the left and another to the right. They moved quietly away while Fairbairn and his 3rd officer held their position, squatting in the darkness. The man investigating the noise came around the corner and Fairbairn was waiting, clocking him smartly across the side of the face. The man slumped and the other officer caught him, dragging him further back along the corridor and then rolling him tight against the shelving. He trotted back to Fairbairn and they began creeping towards the light. At the end of the shelves they paused and drew their pistols. Hepzibah trotted along the shelving, stepping over boxes and piles of equipment. At the end of the shelves was an open space leading to huge doors which could be opened to allow trucks in the building. Over at one side was an admin area with a couple of desks and a lot of paperwork. 5 men were sitting around a small table there, eating their dinner. Fairbairn came to the end of his shadowy corridor. He waited until he could see his other men in their flanking positions ready to go. Then he took a deep breath. "This is the SMPD. You're under arrest. Put your hands in the air or you will be shot." The 5 men had a moment of silent shock. Then 3 of them dumped their chairs over and scattered in different directions. The other 2 sat with their hands in the air. One of the fleeing men ran straight towards a flanking policeman hiding in the shadows, who calmly cracked the man across one knee with his nightstick. He went down, howling. Hepzibah admired the smooth sureness of the stroke which had tumbled him. The other 2 runners went towards the main door and began to pull it open, but Fairbairn put a bullet in the door over their heads and they stopped, raising their hands. All 4 policemen stepped into the light now, guns drawn. Fairbairn held his gun on the 2 men near the door while his comrade dumped them face down on the floor and cuffed them. The 2 at the table were treated with a little more civility, allowed to sit in place as they were cuffed. That turned out to be a mistake. The first of those men grabbed the wrist of the policeman behind him and spun to his feet, pulling the policeman's arm out straight and chopping the back of his elbow. The joint dislocated with a wet pop and the policeman screamed. The man kicked him in the chest and ran, as did the other man who'd been waiting meekly at the table. "Chang, block the back door," Fairbairn yelled. The man on his right flank dashed back the way they had come, pistol in hand. "Mind these 2, Gao," said Fairbairn. "Stay ready." "Sir," said Gao. He stood a few steps behind the men on the floor, scanning all the entrances in the area for movement. Fairbairn stalked towards the stacks, clipping his gun into its holster and drawing his knife. He crouched low and padded into the darkness. Hepzibah followed him from above, fascinated. Fairbairn crept along, senses alert, his steps quiet and balanced. He heard a shuffle and a grunt, stopped for a moment, swivelling his head, then continued on. Hepzibah was amazed at his bravery, walking into darkness where two dangerous men waited. She skipped ahead and found the two he was hunting. One was waiting at a corner, hidden behind a box with a wrench in his hand. The other, a much smaller fellow, had climbed up onto a high layer of shelving. Hepzibah crept down behind him and nudged the vampire, suggesting there was a snack here if it wanted a little blood. The vampire was delighted. This had been a fascinating exercise for the beast, a chance to learn how humans hunted each other, and now here was a reward for its cleverness and patience. It clamped the man's neck in two steely hands and held his carotid arteries closed until he fell unconscious, which only took 10 seconds or so. Then it dug a sharp thumbnail into the side of his neck, avoiding the major artery, and put Hepzibah's mouth over the wound. She could taste the adrenaline, the salt of his sweat, the incense from his family shrine. He was clean and healthy and a feast for the senses. After half a dozen gulps, she felt satisfied enough and put him down and crept over to watch how Fairbairn handled himself. He stalked past the corner where the last man waited, seemingly oblivious, and the man stepped out to give a mighty blow with his wrench, but Fairbairn was expecting it, pirouetting around to avoid the blow and coming close, where his knife took the man in the heart. The man was amazed, struggling to breathe and dropping the tool before finally collapsing. Fairbairn caught him and laid him gently on the floor, keen to make no noise. He began stalking further through the maze, but Hepzibah whispered from above, "It's all right, William, I got the other one." Fairbairn turned and pulled his gun in a perfectly smooth movement. Hepzibah retreated out of range just as quickly, ducking her head back so the shelf was between her and any bullets. She grabbed the unconscious man on the shelf beside her and dumped him over the edge to fall at Fairbairn's feet. "Really, William, if you're going to reject a gift from a lady, she'll just stop giving them to you." "Hepzibah," he whispered. "Of course it's me, you great ninny. Who else would be climbing around a warehouse in the middle of the night? What the hell are you doing here?" She peeped over the edge and saw the gun was no longer pointed her way, so she slithered down next to him. "I was bored. I smelled you going past and wondered what you're up to." "For God's sake, woman, this is no place for—" Fairbairn wasn't quite sure how to finish that sentence. The red monster could go where she wanted and survive it with ease. He looked at the unconscious man she had dumped at his feet. "Is he bleeding? Have you fed on him?" "Oh, just a wee bit. He'll be fine tomorrow, as long as he eats some meat and gets a little rest. I imagine you'll put him somewhere quite restful." "I can't approve of this, Hepzibah. So it's okay to stab them in the heart or shoot them in the face, but a nick and a lick is a bridge too far. Go on with you, Willie. Where's the sense in that?" And and A Nick and a Lick was almost the name of the book. It was the name I preferred, but too many people said they didn't understand it, so The Hopping Ghost it is. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming. I really do appreciate having your company here tonight. There is books there to buy, and Andrew Schwartz, who is our host tonight, will take your money from you for those. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.